Hello and welcome to this particular live stream. My name's Tom Ravlic. I'm a journalist and author, and it's great to be with you on this particular evening. Now, one of the biggest issues that we're looking at in 2021 is, of course, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, when 19 individuals radicalized, boarded planes, and did some great damage to the United States with the collapse of the Twin Towers, and a crash. One of the planes crashed into the Pentagon, and another one landed off course once passengers actually dealt with the pilots when they understood what was going on. 9/11 then led to a lot of activity in Afghanistan, and over the past 20 years, a group of coalition forces, including Australia, have been in the middle of Afghanistan and now in the process of pulling out. There are some loose ends that need to be thought about, and joining me to talk about those is one of the experts in the area, Professor Greg Barton from Deakin University. Greg, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Tom. It's a privilege. I should caveat what I say by saying I'm not an Afghanistan expert. I have been following Salafi jihadi extremism for the last 20 years and following Islamic thought and movements for 30 plus years, but I'm really a Southeast Asianist and Indonesian specialist rather than an Afghan specialist.
But there's a couple of things we might bring up as we move through the discussion. Over the past 20 years, people have been focused on Afghanistan post 9/11 in the context of Al Qaeda, in the context of the Western powers trying to keep at peace. Now, if you had to do a thumbnail sketch for people watching this, Greg, who've never thought deeply about what's going on in Afghanistan and in jihadist movements globally, how would you do it?
Well, there's the last 20 years of the so-called global war on terror that Afghanistan has been the center of. That's not something that Afghanistan is responsible for by itself. Afghanistan is a victim of circumstances and of forces coming from outside it, particularly from its neighbors. Of course, there are problems with the current government in Afghanistan, the problems of corruption and incompetence. But if we start by looking at Afghanistan and saying, why after 20 years can't they sort themselves out, then we're starting about this question the wrong way. Afghanistan's been caught up in our efforts to try and fight terrorism with the means of war. And I think, long story short, we've found that fighting terrorism with the means of war doesn't work well. Obviously, you need to fight insurgencies with military means, but not just military means alone. Whenever you're using methods of war, you need to have a clear sense of what your objective is, what your strategic goal is, and your end state. We've never really had that with either Afghanistan or Iraq, and we're paying the cost for it. Or more to the point, the people of those countries are paying the price for it as well as us. We've just made a series of one mistake after the other, beginning, I think, with framing the whole thing as a global war on terror. That's the wrong way to think about the issue we're dealing with.
When we consider what the West came up against with the jihadist influences, what do we need to reflect on? Because there are people who have over 2 decades looked at the situation. I think they've misdiagnosed it and made the situation worse. For example, commentators who've conflated jihadist ideology with the broader issue of Islam. Do you share that kind of concern?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid concern. We've seen a lot of simplistic reductionist thinking about the problem. We've not really understood the Salafi jihadi narrative, which consistently focuses on forming an Islamic state, as the Taliban say, an Islamic emirate. Not understanding that means we don't understand what they're moving towards and how best to deal with that as far as our interests go. And of course, the ever-present mistake is to conflate this sort of splinter that's come out of the Muslim world Islam itself. I mean, in many respects, the Taliban or Al Qaeda are no more reflective of Islam than the Ku Klux Klan is of Christianity, or pick your other extremist movement. Obviously, there's a connection. Obviously, the language and ideas are intermeshed. They're tied up with identity politics. But anyone can see that if you tried to understand Christianity through the lens of Ku Klux Klan, you pick up some things about American history and problems with endemic racism, but it wouldn't teach you much about Christianity. And the same thing with thinking about Islam and Muslim societies through extremist groups like the Taliban.
When we take a look at the Taliban, and you've looked at the issue of Islamist groups more broadly in the Southeast Asian area, what are the key characteristics of these groups that you notice when you look at them broadly in a general sense?
Well, Tom, clearly we are dealing with groups that use religion, specifically Islam, and take its ideas and familiar themes. They twist and distort them, but they're not doing it in a way which is unique to this kind of extremism. And what we're seeing is something which has many echoes and parallels with other kinds of extremism around the world. So even with the sort of neo-Nazi far-right extremism tied up with toxic identity politics, there are elements of that come through, that we are victims, that these outsiders are robbing us of what we have owed to us, and we have to stand out and resist them. There are in that notions of purification, both from the outsiders and those that would come into our community to defile us. It's a Manichaean vision of the world, a sort of black and white, very simple vision of the world. Part of the appeal of fundamentalism universally and fanaticism is that you take really complex problems and the great big question of human history, which is, why do bad things happen to good people? And you come up with some very simple answers and very appealing answers that basically say it's not your fault as an individual, it's not our fault as a group, it's their fault. And like it or not, we have to go back and fight them. And, we can denounce violence and say we don't like the ways, but, basically this is a fanaticism that says that the ends justify the means. So it's got unique aspects when it comes to Al Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban or Boko Haram or Al Shabaab, but it's picking up on very familiar themes of fanaticism and extremism that occur in other religious communities and occur in contexts that have sort of no overt religious element, but nevertheless have this kind of fanatical identity politics element.
Is it fair to observe that across the Islamist groups that you've looked at over the years, that the ideological chassis, if you like, is pretty much the same? And depending on where these groups sit, whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, or Al-Qaeda or Islamic State in some of the countries you've looked at in Southeast Asia, they just localize and tweak the rhetoric for domestic consumption.
I think that's fair to say in general terms, Tom, and I'll try and sort of paint a sort of broad brush sketch of what that means. And I just said a minute ago that we have to be careful of reductionism and being overly simplistic. So here's the dilemma: we've got to try and paint with a broad brush to get a big picture view of things, but recognize that it's more complex than a simple discussion can capture. Religions throughout human history have veered towards being co-opted by political interests. There's always been tension between sort of the religious elite and political elite. Identity politics have often come into things. Fanaticism, no doubt stemming out of something about human nature, is a reoccurring theme. But having said that, which is to say that throughout Islamic history, there have been fanatical and extremist groups, and violence has been used for political purposes, and it's been wrapped up with identity politics, not uniquely to Islam or the Muslim world, but in ways that are familiar through human history. What we're seeing with what's called Salafi jihadism by many scholars is something that's quite recent. It really emerged in the second half of the 20th century and has continued to evolve through this 21st century. It picks up on elements that go back much earlier, but it's largely a product of modernity. Even in Saudi Arabia, the formation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is very much tied up in a deal that was struck between the House of Saud and the descendants of Abdul Wahab and his ideas about purification of Islam, which go back several centuries, were further developed through the 19th and 20th century, and then opportunistically incorporated into the Saudi state as a kind of a way of propping up the House of Saud with religious authority. It's a kind of puritanical fanaticism, which is not necessarily violent, but it certainly has exclusionary elements. But that was married with another kind of extremism coming out of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, and also picking up at various times South Asian extremism, particularly out of the madrasa of Deobandi extremism, which is the major direct element running through the Taliban coming out of India and Pakistan. So when the leading original thinker of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, was imprisoned by Egyptian authorities, allegedly for his role in trying to bring about regime change. He was eventually executed in prison in 1966, but during his time in prison, he was given some space to write, and his prison writings got increasingly dark. And it seems that Sayyid Qutb borrowed very heavily from the ideas of revolutionary Marxism about sort of a consciousness raising, bringing up a vanguard that would eventually precipitate a revolution, and that revolutionary change was necessary to wipe out a system that was completely wrong and replace it with a system that would make a pure and proper society possible. Inside Qutb's idea, you couldn't really have an Islamic state ruled by Islamic law, by Sharia, as he understood it, without this revolutionary change. So that idea of revolutionary change absolutely comes from revolutionary Marxism, but it was borrowed by Sayyid Qutb. After his execution, his brother Muhammad Qutb and many of the colleagues fled to Saudi Arabia, where they were given exile, with the Egyptian state being glad to have them out of the way. And it was there that they married those ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, which, by the way, also influenced the Islamic Revolution in Iran, which seems counterintuitive, but that's another story. Those ideas of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood married with Saudi Wahhabism to come up with what some people have referred to as a kind of neo-Wahhabi extremism, which took form particularly around Osama bin Laden as one of the sort of charismatic movement leaders. He, of course, was tolerated by the Saudi state for a while, forced into exile, first in Sudan and then in Afghanistan. And it was in Afghanistan, leading so-called mujahideen or holy warriors to fight the Soviet-backed occupation, that Al-Qaeda was formed. And Al-Qaeda, as is well known, the name simply means the base. It was to be a base for training up and equipping mujahideen, not primarily to fight the Soviets, but to learn from the Soviet battlefield experience and take it back to the home countries. So there was always this idea with Al-Qaeda of a global jihad, and eventually of forming a caliphate or Islamic state when conditions were possible. This tended to be a sort of way down the track vision for Islamic State, the splinter group that broke away from Islamic State through the conflict in Iraq, Islamic State in Iraq, and then Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. ISIS brought that forward and actually put into practice for some years a physical caliphate in Syria and Iraq. And there was a parting of ways between leaders with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but that idea was held in common. One of the common elements of this kind of militant extremism, which has been referred to as Salafi jihadism, after this marriage of Salafi Wahhabi fundamentalist thinking with taking the idea of jihad or holy war as preemptive, proactive violence. one of the ideas that has been constant is to tap into local grievances and local insurgencies and try and tie them back into a global struggle. It's much easier to get people fired up about a local grievance. That was the case with Afghanistan in the 1980s, for example, when the Soviet military was there. It's much harder to get people to see beyond that to a global struggle. And most people, frankly, are more concerned about their village and their family and their clan than they are about what happens the other side of the ocean. There has been a sort of turning of the wheel over the last few years with the collapse of the physical caliphate, the Islamic State caliphate in Syria and Iraq. That insurgency has gone to ground in northern Syria and northern Iraq, just as Al-Qaeda also operates in parallel and in competition. But both of these movements have now reached out, particularly across the African continent, to try and tap into local grievances and local insurgency. So we saw that recently with an ISIS-linked insurgent advance in Mozambique. We see it in Mali in West Africa. We see Al-Qaeda locked into Shabab in Somalia and Kenya, and these groups reaching out across West and Central Africa, groups like Boko Haram. Some degree of competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but a common theme that you could take this local grievance and turn it back into a global struggle. The big issue with Afghanistan at the moment, of course, is that on paper the Taliban are saying in their televised peace negotiations and public statements, which certainly present them in new clothes and looking much more sophisticated, as saying that all they want is to get foreign troops out of Afghanistan, and that they will no longer have any relationship with Al-Qaeda, and certainly they'll not allow Al-Qaeda to use Afghanistan as a safe haven for global terror. And of course, the reason for going into Afghanistan in October 2001 was to go after the Al-Qaeda leadership and deny them using Afghanistan as a safe haven. It won't surprise you to know that, this is a matter of interpretation, we can't be absolutely certain on what people believe and what's happening, and no doubt there are competing currents. But it's my subjective view that the Taliban is not acting in good faith and is not being at all honest, or rather they're being disingenuous. They are joined at the hip with Al-Qaeda. The leadership of the Taliban in Afghanistan shares many common individuals and social networks with the leadership of Al-Qaeda based in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They tied up also with the Pakistani Taliban, which has given sanctuary in Afghanistan, just as the leadership, or at least the families of the Afghan Taliban, are given sanctuary in Pakistan. There's the whole complex issue of proxy conflict coming out of the Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, ISI, the Pakistani military, and a sense that they can use these militia for their own purposes, which I think is ultimately very mistaken and completely immoral and very dangerous to Pakistan's interest. But that means that we're being presented with a charade by the Taliban in Doha and elsewhere, saying that they just want to form a peace deal and go into a partnership in government in Kabul, when in fact their intention is to set up what they've always called their Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and very much to continue to allow Al-Qaeda to remain as not just their house guest, but as their valued colleague and partner. And what Al-Qaeda does with that opportunity, of course, the Taliban is in no position to stop. So we are in the process of seeing Afghanistan once again becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda and competing groups like ISIS, which is also there. There are important differences between these groups. There are important differences the way that this is played out on the ground. There's differences with what's happening with Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or Abu Sayyaf group in Mindanao. But basically there is this common element of trying to bring about a revolution which brings the perfect system, which is an Islamic state, an emirate, a caliphate, ruled by Sharia. And that vision is very narrow and very reactionary. It's violently patriarchal and strangely mixed up with elements of modernity, but presents an anti-modern position and an anti-Western position. Well, not just anti-Western, but antithetical to to the states in which it finds itself. So whether that's the nation of Pakistan or India or the Philippines or Indonesia, there's a longer and more complex story there. You get the picture from that thumbnail sketch.
There's a lot. There's a lot for people to sort of reflect on there, Greg. A recent report by a UN monitoring group does provide some, well, a fair bit of background in what's going on in Afghanistan on the ground. And you're right, there's a potpourri of jihadist groups that appear to have sort of moved around Afghanistan, but I think if I recall correctly, there's something like 15 provinces where the Taliban have gotten their foothold and Al-Qaeda has accompanied them. And we've also seen some videos of very disturbing things done by Taliban fighters to others to reinforce that they're back in business effectively.
Yeah, we of course are talking about open source information, so we don't know what is known to intelligence agencies. We can get a sense of that by their worried expressions. You know, the US intelligence analysis that's made public speaks of a concern that Afghanistan could fall to the Taliban within the next 6 months. It's sort of an accelerated assessment, compared with previous years. There's so much that's unknown about this, of course. We do know that the Taliban have limited power and limited troop strength, and that they are really banking on a collapse of morale in order to complete this ambition of taking charge of Afghanistan. They have almost certainly taken charge of more than half of the districts, the 407 districts of Afghanistan. They right now fighting around the edges of cities and trying to penetrate city centres. So they've been active in Herat and Lashkargah in recent days. They are not in a position of unquestioned strength where they can just march in and take control. But on the other hand, what we've seen is a very sharp escalation of military advance and violence since the beginning of the US military drawdown in May, and a surge of the Taliban across Afghanistan. And it does seem, I mean, we shouldn't say this is a fait accompli because this is playing into their sort of propaganda hands. They're trying to push this collapse of morale. But it does seem, unless the US and partners revise their course and manage this transition better, specifically with providing air support and civilian contractor maintenance for the Afghan Air Force so that they can provide air support, then the Taliban are likely to continue their advances, if not for the entire country, then for the majority of it. And in the midst of this, we have reports of thousands, some say as many as 8,000 or 10,000 foreign fighters in Afghanistan. It's impossible to verify. I think there's a couple of things that stand out as being clear. One is that the history of 20 years of military engagement in Afghanistan has been covered by lack of willingness to be clear with metrics, very often lack of clear metrics themselves, so not even properly counting and acknowledging within the US and other militaries what's going on, a sort of unwillingness to face the facts, a spin and cover up. You know, there have been periods of time, 2016, 2017, when the US military was producing publicly available metrics, and then eventually that tap was suddenly switched off. I think because there's some unpalatable truths. And so at the moment, we have people like Bill Roggio at Long Wars Journal producing maps. He's done this for years, tracking the advance of the Taliban. Some people take issue with him and say that he's too simplistic with his definitions, but there's not any better source of information available. And basically others who are doing similar kind of tracking produce a similar picture. And we hear voices from Kabul saying that this is exaggerated and it's not going to be like this. And we hear other voices from Washington or elsewhere, you know, trying to walk things backwards. But it seems like there's a combination of lack of good data metrics, lack of willingness to face up to the picture as we have it, and just a surprising lack of intelligence at what is actually going on. Given we've been there 20 years, we should have a really good sense of things. But it seems like even at the highest classified levels, we don't really know. That seems to be the picture. So, for example, to give one famous anecdote, the leader of the Afghanistan Taliban was dead for several years, and his death was covered up. It was spoofed, and we didn't really know about it. It caught us by surprise. So if we can be caught out by something as simple as that, when it comes to the question of asking how many foreign fighters are in Afghanistan at the moment, to the extent that they're there, that almost certainly came via Al-Qaeda. How large is the Al-Qaeda force strength? What areas are they in? What are they doing? I don't think we really have a clear picture at all. And I do think there's a real lack of willingness to face up to these difficult truths because they're just unpalatable.
One of the things that has been reported in the media, of course, and I've done a bit of writing on this myself, is the fact that there have been people who have been employed either through contractors or directly to assist Australian forces and other forces over a 20-year period. They're facing a dilemma at the moment. Their safety is in grave doubt. What are the things that you're observing at the moment with the situation with people who were interpreters and staff of Western forces?
Well, Tom, it's a really grim situation. In Australia, quite famously, we've been paying attention to alleged war crimes carried out by a small number of special forces personnel in Afghanistan. And there certainly seems to be some palatable truth to that. No doubt they're not alone. No doubt there are others, particularly in the special forces community, that have been involved in some things that are war crimes. And beyond that, war always produces sort of horrible results. But there's another kind of moral failing occurring at the moment with respect to this military engagement in Afghanistan, and that is that we've worked, when I say we, the international community, the ISAF, NATO linked military forces, we've worked with tens and tens of thousands of Afghans over the last 2 decades in jobs like certainly interpreters, but also contractors, maintenance, security, hospitality, working in kitchens, whatever. In the eyes of the Taliban, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that these are all seen as infidels who have betrayed the Islamic Emirate and are liable to punishment. Some of these Afghan contractors have been directly contracted and have worked in acknowledged roles like military interpreters, but many others have worked at embassies and diplomatic missions and bases, Bagram Air Base and other places, in ways that are harder to categorize. Many of them have been subcontracted. All of the ISAF alliance nations have ways of providing visas to bring out Afghan interpreters and others, and in many cases their dependents. But this Kafkaesque bureaucracy involved. So the US, are currently processing 18,000 applications for civ visas, but they acknowledge that there could be as many as 100,000 people in total involved because of dependents. If somebody's worked as an interpreter, likely a man, they will have a wife and children and perhaps parents, all of whom are liable to be killed by the Taliban if caught. Now, that question of if caught depends, if the Taliban take over all of Afghanistan, then everyone is in a really dire position. If they are held at their current point of advancement, controlling half the country, there's still a lot of people who are very vulnerable. And there are many reports already of assassinations. And by the way, the Taliban doesn't have to take control of Kabul to assassinate people inside Kabul. It's been doing this time and time again. Just this week, inside the fortified green zone, there was an attack, suicide attack on the defense minister, the Afghan defense minister. Didn't reach him, but it's a recurring story of reaching deep into the most fortified sections of the capital and assassinating people. There has been at least 10 Afghan pilots from the Afghan Air Force who have been assassinated off base. The Taliban don't have any air power. If they can neutralize the Afghan air power, it gives them a great advantage. Rather than bringing down an aircraft, killing a pilot who was going to the shops by somebody undercover, a very effective way of advancing their cause. So when you think of the position of interpreters, it's not just interpreters, it's anyone who's worked with international forces over the last 2 decades and their family members, their dependents. And the Taliban operate a system of, what you might ironically call neighborhood watch, a dreadful system of spying and using neighbors to keep track of people. And that's led to the phenomenon that's quite famous now of night letters, of letters being posted on doors in the dead of night saying, we know who you are, we know who you've been working with, and we're coming after you. Designed, of course, to instill fear and to intimidate others. And when we look at that situation, we realize that there are literally, in excess of 100,000 Afghan lives at stake from direct reprisals by the Taliban. And yet the Kafkaesque bureaucratic processes that all of these nations, coalition nations, have in place to bring these people out to safety are too slow, too tedious, too uneven, often just not possible. Often people who are really in danger and who have served with dignity and bravery are excluded because of some technicality. In the case of the US, if you're not served for more than 2 years as a direct contracted interpreter, you're not counted. Some people have worked with coalition forces in locations that aren't regarded as being frontline, and they're not counted, or their job title is not counted, or they're subcontracted. And I think this is a worse moral failing in the context of war than the direct war crimes. War crimes are horrible things, and they need to be sought out and prosecuted. But in some ways, it's even more horrible to think that through some banal, as I said, Kafkaesque bureaucratic process, we just leave tens and tens of thousands of people to their fate and say it's not our problem. They didn't fill out Form 1AB correctly, and they didn't qualify. That's a crime even worse than what happens in the heat of conflict.
Greg, would it be fair to observe, and I know you were mindful of the time and you've been very generous with it today, would it be fair to observe the following? After 20 years of activity on the part of a Western coalition, with some assistance from people in Afghanistan to try and to reshape the country, is there a risk that we're coming full circle to having Afghanistan the way it was pre-2001, pre-9/11?
Tom, I think that's a very real and immediate risk. I acknowledge that we don't want to do the work of the Taliban and their propaganda. Their ultimate victory, in their terms, depends on a collapse of morale. And so we have to be careful about how we describe this. But we have senior British and American and other international military, currently serving, former serving leaders saying just the same thing, that the worst case scenario seems imminent unless we do something. And of course, that unless we do something is the really critical thing here. We shouldn't be fatalistic. The Taliban are not in a position of absolute strength. They can't simply dominate. But the balance was tipped when the US abruptly withdrew remaining forces. And I think we need to understand that we're not facing a binary choice here of do we carry on the forever war with tens and tens of thousands of foreign troops, or do we say enough is enough and walk away? I think we should be thinking of Afghanistan a bit more like we think of, for example, the Korean Peninsula, and say, and the troop numbers in the Korean Peninsula are probably misleading, with a small number of international troops, 10, 20,000 troops from an international coalition remaining in Afghanistan, that can provide security for Kabul airport and other airports, for the diplomatic missions, for the aid workers. It can provide security for international contractors who service the aircraft, the helicopters and the C-130s of the Afghan Air Force. And it can prop up morale and give a sense of international ongoing cooperation in fighting a threat that is not the making of the Afghan people by themselves. It's a product of great power competition, obviously, coming out of the Cold War, going past the Cold War. It's a product of Pakistan and other nations, including Iran, fighting a proxy conflict using militias. It's a product of the aspirations of Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. Afghanistan is the victim of this. These 38 million people of Afghanistan are the victims of this. They're also victims of their own corrupt government, that's true. but with a modest ongoing investment, we could maintain the balance so the Taliban can't complete that advance. But by abruptly pulling everything out in the way that Biden has done, I think in a very irresponsible, at best very naive way, it opens a space for this collapse of morale, which is the Taliban's counting on, and for the balance to tip in such a way that they do take control of the whole country. Then we are back to the 1990s, back to 2001. And then Al-Qaeda does have a safe operating base inside Afghanistan. It's a threat to the global community. Already we've seen, allegedly, if you think of that interview with CNN via intermediaries in Pakistan, Al-Qaeda leaders saying, we have prevailed with the help of our brothers in the Taliban. We have fought the long fight, the good fight, and we've prevailed, and God is on our side, and victory is ours. That message, going back to this question of Salafi jihadi narrative, is really key to strengthening that movement or network of movements around the world, and it will be a problem for all of us. So yes, we're back to square one. 20 years on from 9/11, we risk being back where we started, in some ways even worse, having made the problems worse, if not in Afghanistan, certainly in Iraq, opening the space for the creation of Islamic State. And we just don't want to know about it. We're sort of delusional and in denial. And my point at this point in August 2021 is that a modest ongoing investment of boots on the ground to back up civilian contractors and workers and back up the Afghan military and government can keep the tide from turning in the direction of the Afghan Taliban. But if we just abruptly pull out and say we're done, 20 years is enough, we're going out of here, then we've literally gone into the shop, broken the merchandise, walked out and said it's not our problem, And I think we've got to accept that if you break it, you own it. We have a responsibility to stay the course. We've been willing to do this in the Korean Peninsula. We have large US troop deployments in Okinawa and elsewhere across the Pacific. Australia is part of that engagement in the ANZUS coalition. We recognize that as being necessary in the world where we live in. I think having some thousands of international troops backing up thousands more of international contractors and workers in Afghanistan is a reasonable price to pay. It's not a perfect world, and it doesn't give us a perfect solution. But to think that just packing up and going home and letting things take their course in Afghanistan is a responsible or morally acceptable position, I think is to deceive ourselves. And I think we'll end up paying the price for it. But most of all, the people of Afghanistan, in the first instance, will pay the price for it.
Greg, that is a very sobering assessment on which you conclude our discussion today. Thank you so much for taking us through some of the history, some of the complexities, some of the issues to do with Salafi jihadism, which are often confusing for people. And I hope that anyone that watches the interview in the coming days is able to get precisely an understanding of how complex this thing is. So thanks very much for that.
It's been good speaking, Tom. There's so much more we could discuss. This is a complex situation, but there are some simple truths, I think, that stand out as being clear at this point that we need to face up to. And I think that history will judge us on the basis of how we respond now, particularly to those who have worked with us in Afghanistan.
Greg, thank you so much.
Thank you.